The water on March 7th tested at 0.3 milligrams per liter free chlorine residual. I logged it at 6:14 in the morning, same as every morning, standing in the treatment building with my boots still wet from the walk over. The DPD tablet turned the sample the right shade of pink. Turbidity was 0.08 NTU. pH sat at 7.2. Every number on the daily log matched the numbers from the day before and the week before that. The water was clean. I signed the sheet and closed the binder. The water was clean, and 4 hours later Delia Tulik's kitchen faucet ran salt. Not brackish, not mineral heavy, salt, ocean salt. She called me not the borough, because that is how it works in a village of 260 people on the Chukchi coast. The water plant operator is your neighbor. The water plant operator went to school with your daughter. The water plant operator's name is Paul Agnasaga, and he will walk to your house with a test kit before the borough picks up the phone. I need to go back and explain how I got to this point, because what happened with the water was only the first thing, and it was not the worst thing. And I am telling this now while I can still describe the sequence in order. That matters. The order matters. By the end, I will explain why. I have lived in Kugnik my entire life. The name is Inupiaq, and it refers to the shape of the lagoon mouth where the old village stood before the Corps relocated everyone to the mainland in 1974. The new site sits on a gravel bench about 30 feet above sea level, which is high ground for the north slope. Tundra runs flat to the south until it meets the Imnaktuk River, 8 miles inland. To the north and west, the lagoon separates us from a barrier island chain that takes the worst of the Chukchi storms. East, the coast curves toward Wainwright, 60-some miles away by snow machine trail when the ice is right. 263 people lived in Kugnik as of last October's head count. Inupiaq, mostly, with a handful of borough employees and teachers from Anchorage and Fairbanks rotating through. We have a school, a clinic with a health aide, a village public safety officer, a fire station, a fuel tank farm, and the water treatment plant, which is my responsibility. I hold an Alaska DEC Level 2 operator certification. I have held it for 9 years. Before me, my Uncle Raymond ran the plant for 11, and before him, a series of borough contract operators who stayed a season or two and left. The plant is a prefabricated steel building, 40 by 24 feet, insulated, heated by an oil-fired boiler. Source water comes from a lake 1.5 miles southeast of the village. The intake runs through an insulated utilidor to the plant, where I run it through filtration and chlorination before it feeds into the village distribution system. In winter, the lake sits under 4 feet of ice and the intake draws from depth. The system works. I know every valve, every joint, every filter housing, every circuit on the control panel, because I have maintained them with my own hands for close to a decade. This is the part where a different person might tell you about themselves. I am not going to do that except to say I am 41 years old. I live with my partner Eileen and our 2 kids in a 3-bedroom borough house 200 yards from the plant, and I can see the plant's exhaust vent from my kitchen window. When the boiler is firing right, the steam rises straight. When something is off, I can usually tell from the kitchen before the alarm panel tells me at the building. I mention this because that habit, watching the steam, became important later. March in Kugnik is still deep winter. 20 below most mornings, darker than people from outside imagine. By March, the sun is technically above the horizon for parts of the day, but the light is low and flat and colored like aluminum. The snow is hard-packed, sculptured into sastrugi by the constant northeast wind. Moving between buildings, you lean into it. The cold sits in your chest if you breathe wrong. I have done this walk to the plant in whiteouts and in calm, at 40 below and at 20 above. And I can tell you the distance is exactly 192 steps from my front door to the plant's entrance. I have never miscounted, because counting is what keeps your mind on the walk and off the cold. On March 6th, the day before the salt water, I walked to the plant in the dark. Wind was from the northeast at maybe 15 knots. Temperature was minus 18 Fahrenheit. I did my morning rounds, checked the boiler, checked the chlorine injection system, ran my residual test, logged the turbidity and pH, confirmed the pressure on the distribution header, and called the Borough Utilities office in Utqiagvik to report the daily readings. The call takes 45 seconds. I read the numbers, they confirm receipt, I hang up. The satellite phone connection was clear that morning, which is not always the case. The woman at Utilities, Janice, said copy on all readings and asked if I needed anything on the next barge priority list. I told her I could use a case of DPD reagent tablets and a new set of O-rings for the filter housing. She said she would add them. Normal. All of this was normal. After the morning check, I walked home, ate breakfast with the kids before school, and then went back to the plant around 10 to do a second chlorine test and check the distribution pressure. This is my routine and has been for 9 years. The afternoon I spent at home, patching a slow leak in the Utilidor insulation wrap near the clinic. The leak was not urgent, but exposed insulation in March invites freeze-up, and a frozen Utilidor section means half the village loses water until I can thaw it, which can take 12 hours with a torpedo heater and a lot of crawling. I patched it with foam and tape, tested the wrap temperature with a contact thermometer, logged the repair in my maintenance notebook, and walked home in the gray twilight that passes for afternoon. Eileen had caribou stew on the stove. The kids were doing homework at the kitchen table. The dog was asleep on the rug by the door. I could see the plant's exhaust vent through the window, steam rising straight in the cold. Nothing was wrong. I say this clearly because what came next did not have a warning, and if I had known what the water would do the next day, I cannot honestly say I would have done anything different. There was nothing to see. The morning of March 7th was colder, minus 23. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, which made the cold feel deeper, more committed. My breath hung in the air in front of me as I walked to the plant. I remember the steps that morning felt louder than usual on the packed snow, each one cracking like a knuckle. Inside the plant, the boiler was running steady, the building warm. I did the rounds. Every number was right. I signed the log. At 10:12 in the morning, Delia Tulik called me on the village CB. She said the water from her kitchen tap tasted like the ocean. I pulled on my parka and walked to her house, which is on the west side of the village, about 400 feet from mine. Delia is 68. She was born in the old village on the barrier island, moved to the mainland site when she was a teenager, and has lived in the same house since the borough built it in 1991. She handed me a glass of water from her tap. I tasted it. It was salt, not slightly brackish, not a hint of mineral. It tasted like seawater. I could feel the salinity on my lips after I set the glass down. I tested the sample with my portable kit. The chlorine residual was correct, 0.3 milligrams per liter, which meant the water had been through my treatment process. The pH was off, though. It read 7.9, and our treated water runs at 7.2 consistently. I tested the conductivity with a meter I borrowed from the school's science closet 2 years ago and never returned. The conductivity was over 40,000 microsiemens per centimeter. Seawater is typically around 50,000. Fresh water is under 1,000. The water coming out of Delia's tap had the chlorine residual of treated village water and the salinity of the Chukchi Sea. I walked back to the plant, tested the output at the distribution header, fresh, clean. 0.3 milligrams per liter free chlorine, conductivity at 287, pH at 7.2. I flushed the line, tested again. Same good numbers. I walked back to Delia's and tested her tap again. Salt, no change. Over the next 2 hours, I tested the water at 6 other houses, working outward from Delia's in a rough circle. The results made no sense. 3 houses on the west side of the village had salt water. Every house on the east side, including mine, had clean water. The distribution system in Kugnik does not have east and west branches. It is a single pressurized loop fed from the plant. Every tap draws from the same pipe. If the source were contaminated, every tap in the village would show it. If a section of pipe had cracked and let in groundwater, the pressure would drop, and I would see it on the gauge. The pressure was holding steady. That night I called the borough utilities office on the satellite phone and reported the readings. Janice was off shift. A man named Dennis took the call. I read him the conductivity numbers from the affected houses and the clean numbers from the plant output and the unaffected houses. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me to repeat the conductivity readings from Delia's tap. I did. He said he would pass it to the utilities engineer and someone would call me back. I asked when. He said he did not know. Nobody called back that night. I flushed every line in the western loop, which is not an official designation. There is no western loop, but I had started thinking of the affected zone that way because I needed a name for it. After flushing, I tested Delia's tap one more time. Fresh, clean, conductivity at 290. I told her it might have been a pocket of sediment, which I did not believe, but she was worried and I wanted her to sleep. I walked home. The steam from the plant was rising straight. I stood in the cold and watched it for a long time, because something in the back of my mind was already working on a problem I did not yet have the language for. Eileen opened the door and asked if I was coming in. I said yes. I went inside. 3 days later, on March the 10th, the salt water came back. This time it was in 7 houses, all on the west side, and also in the clinic. Martha Umatuk, the health aide, called me at 7 in the morning. She said the water in the clinic smelled different. I tested it. Salt. Conductivity at 38,000. The distribution pressure at the plant was normal. The plant output was clean. I should describe what the village felt like during this period, because the water problem was real and people were concerned, but it was not panic. Kugnik has experienced water issues before. 3 years ago, the intake line partially froze, and I spent 2 days thawing it with the torpedo heater. 7 years ago, the chlorination pump failed, and I hand-dosed the tank for a week until a replacement arrived on a charter flight from Utqiagvik. People here understand that infrastructure in the Arctic is always in negotiation with the cold, and they understand that I am the one managing that negotiation. So when the salt water appeared, they called me. I came, and they trusted that I would figure it out. That trust is the heaviest thing I carry from this. The borough sent an engineer named Dale Pruitt on March 14th. He flew in on the morning Wienair charter, which comes twice a week when weather allows. Dale was maybe 35, clean-shaven, wearing a borough-issued parka that looked like it had been worn twice. He had a Pelican case of testing equipment and a laptop with the distribution system schematics. We spent the day together at the plant and then walking the Utilidor route, which runs above ground on wooden supports because of the permafrost. At every access point, Dale took samples and logged them. The plant was clean. The main distribution line was clean. We could not find a point of contamination. At Delia's house, the water tested salt. At the clinic, salt. At the school, which is on the east side, fresh. Dale stood in Delia's kitchen with his conductivity meter in his hand and looked at me and said, "How long has this been going on?" I told him 8 days. He said, "Is it always the same houses?" I said, "Yes, the west side." He asked if there was any infrastructure difference between the east and west sides of the village. Piping material, pipe age, depth, anything. I told him no. The entire system was installed in 2003 by the same contractor, same pipe, same depth, same specs. He typed something into his laptop and then closed it. That evening, Dale and I sat in the plant and went through the system drawings line by line. He found nothing. I found nothing. The system was not complicated enough to hide a problem. Dale said he would recommend the borough send a crew to excavate a section of pipe on the west side and inspect it physically. I agreed. He also said he wanted to test the source lake. I told him the lake was 1.5 miles away and the surface was under 4 feet of ice, but I had an auger and a snow machine and could get him there in the morning. He said fine. We reached the lake at 8:30 the next morning. The sky was clear, which in March on the north slope means a blue so pale it looks white at the edges, fading to absolute color directly above. The lake surface was wind-polished ice, flat and featureless except for pressure ridges at the south end, where the current from the inlet stream stressed the freeze. I augured a hole near the intake point, which I know by a GPS waypoint logged when the system was installed. The ice was 47 inches thick. When the auger broke through, water welled up clear and cold. Dale tested it, fresh. Conductivity 195. pH 6.9. No anomaly. He tested it again from a second hole I drilled 30 meters north. Same numbers. We drilled a third hole farther out near the center of the lake. Fresh. Dale packed up his equipment and we rode back to the village. On the way, he asked me what I thought was happening. I told him I did not know. He asked if I had considered the possibility of a saltwater intrusion from subsurface, maybe a connection between the groundwater table and the lagoon that had opened up due to permafrost degradation. I had considered it. The problem was that saltwater intrusion would affect the source lake or the buried sections of the intake line, and both were testing clean. The contamination was appearing downstream of the treatment plant, in specific taps, without any detectable entry point. I told Dale that. He did not respond. He adjusted his goggles against the wind, and we rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that means someone has run out of professional explanations. Dale left on the afternoon charter. He said the borough would schedule an excavation crew, probably within 2 weeks. I thanked him and watched the Twin Otter lift off the gravel strip and bank south toward Utqiagvik until it was a speck against the white. Then I walked back to the plant, because the day was not over and the readings still needed to be logged. What I have not mentioned yet is the sound. On the night of March the 12th, 2 days before Dale arrived, Eileen woke me at around 2 in the morning. She said she could hear something. I listened. The house was quiet. The wind was low. I could hear the boiler cycling at the plant, which I can hear from our bedroom, on still nights because of how sound carries in extreme cold. I told Eileen I did not hear anything. She said it was not in the house. She said it was under the house. Our house is built on pilings, like every structure in Kugnik, to prevent heat transfer into the permafrost. There is a crawl space of about 3 feet between the floor joists and the ground. I put on my boots and parka and went outside with a flashlight. The cold was immediate, maybe 20 below, perfectly still. I crouched and aimed the beam under the house. Gravel pad, piling bases, some stored lumber, nothing moving, nothing wrong. But I could hear it now standing outside. A low sound, not mechanical, not wind. It sat below the range where you can identify direction. It was more of a pressure in the ears than a sound. I have heard infrasound once before, when a fuel barge ran its engines at idle in the lagoon and the low-frequency vibration carried through the ground. This was similar, but not identical. The barge sound had a rhythm tied to the engine cycle. This had no rhythm. It was constant, like a tone held indefinitely at a frequency almost too low to register. I walked around the house. The sound did not change. I walked toward the plant. It did not change. I walked west, toward Delia's end of the village. It might have increased slightly, but I was not sure. Eileen was waiting at the door when I came back in. She asked what it was. I said I did not know. Maybe pressure change in the ground from thermal cycling. She looked at me with the expression she uses when I am managing her instead of answering her. Then she went back to bed. The sound continued through the next day. I did not mention it to Dale because he was focused on the water, and because I was not confident it was real enough to report. Infrasound can be caused by wind-over terrain features, by ocean swell interacting with the coast, by any number of atmospheric conditions. I told myself this even as I noticed that the sound did not change with the wind. and the sea ice was solid to the horizon, and no swell was reaching the coast. On March 18th, 4 days after Dale left, I found the first crack. I was walking the utilidor route for my weekly inspection. The utilidor is an above-ground insulated conduit that carries the water distribution pipe from the plant to the village. It runs on wooden supports about 4 feet off the ground and connects to risers at each building. I walk it every week looking for insulation damage, sagging, frost buildup, anything that could compromise the system. The route is 3/4 of a mile, and I know every support post, every joint, every patch I have ever made. Between the plant and the first building connection, the utilidor crosses a section of open ground, about 150 feet, where the gravel pad that the village sits on transitions to natural tundra. The support posts in this section are driven into the active layer and rest on the permafrost table. I have checked their depth and plumb every spring for 9 years. On March 18th, the third post from the plant was tilted. Not dramatically, maybe 4 degrees off vertical. I put a level on it to confirm. The ground at the base of the post was cracked. The crack ran roughly east-west, about 8 feet long, and was maybe 1.5 inches wide. Frost crystals lined the interior walls of the crack, which meant it had been open long enough for moisture to migrate into it from the surrounding soil. At that temperature, that takes at least several days, I followed the crack with my eyes. It extended beyond the utilidor footprint in both directions, disappearing into the snow cover on either side. I brushed snow away with my boot. The crack continued. I followed it west for about 40 feet before losing it under a snowdrift. I went back to the utilidor post, photographed the crack and the post tilt with my phone, and noted the GPS coordinates. Then I continued my inspection. The rest of the utilidor was normal. That evening I called the borough and reported the crack. The woman on the phone, not Janice, said she would log it. I asked her to flag it for the geotechnical division, because ground cracking in continuous permafrost in March is not a seasonal active layer phenomenon. The active layer does not thaw until June. In March, the ground is frozen solid to a depth of several hundred feet. Cracks in March mean something is happening below the frost line, and that is not supposed to happen. She said she would flag it. I began tracking the crack. Every day after my plant rounds, I walked the crack line, brushing snow, measuring width with a tape at marked points. On March 19th, it was 1.5 inches at the widest point. On March 21st, it was 2 inches. On March 24th, 2 3/4. The crack was growing, slowly and steadily, and it was also getting longer. By March 24th, I had traced it for over 300 feet in a roughly east-west line that passed directly under the utilidor, continued west through the gravel pad, and approached the foundation pilings of the 2 westernmost houses. Delia Tulik's house was one of them. On March 26th, I noticed the sound had changed. It was louder on the west side of the village, noticeably, and it had developed a quality I can only describe as directional. Standing near the crack on the western edge of the gravel pad, the sound seemed to rise from the crack itself. I crouched and put my bare hand on the ground beside the crack. The ground was vibrating. Not shaking vibrating, the way a pipe vibrates when water is flowing through it under pressure. Except there was no pipe here. The utilidor was 4 feet above my head. The ground was permafrost. I told Eileen that night. Not the theory, because I did not have one. I told her the facts. The water anomaly on the west side, the crack, the sound, the vibration. She listened the way she listens, which is completely and without interrupting, and then with one question that goes to the center of it. She asked me whether the 2 things were connected, the salt water and the crack. I said I thought they might be. She asked how. I said I did not know. The borough excavation crew arrived on April 2nd. 3 men from the utilities division and a small tracked excavator that came in on a Hercules charter. It took them 2 days to set up and begin digging. They chose a point on the west distribution line about 60 feet from Delia's house, where the pipe runs underground between two utilidor risers. The ground was frozen. They used a combination of the excavator and steam points to thaw and remove soil. By the afternoon of April 4th, they had the pipe exposed at about 3 feet depth. The pipe was intact. No cracks, no corrosion, no joints failing. The crew foreman, a man named Tony who had done this work across the North Slope for 20 years, said the pipe was in better condition than 90% of what he dug up. He tested the water at the exposed section. Fresh. Clean. He sealed the excavation and told me he would report no defect found. I walked him over to the crack before he left. By then, it had widened to over 3 inches in places and extended nearly 500 feet. I showed him the utilidor post tilt, which had increased to 7 degrees. Tony looked at the crack for a long time. He asked me when it had first appeared. I told him mid-March. He asked if the Borough Geotechnical team had been notified. I said yes. He said he would mention it in his report. Then he said something I have thought about every day since. He said this is not a thermal crack. He said the geometry is wrong. Thermal contraction cracks in permafrost form polygonal networks. They do not run in straight lines for 500 feet. I asked him what would cause a straight crack like this. He said he did not know. He said it looked like something under the surface was pulling the ground apart, the way a foundation settles when the subgrade shifts. But there was no foundation here. There was no subgrade. There was permafrost 300 feet deep, and permafrost does not shift in March. Tony and his crew flew out the next morning. The excavation was backfilled and tamped. The pipe was fine. The water on the west side was still intermittently salt. I need to describe what April did to the village, because the technical details matter less than what it felt like to live inside this. The salt water came and went without pattern. Some mornings, every tap on the west side ran clean. Other mornings, salt. No correlation to temperature, wind, barometric pressure, or any condition I could measure. I tested obsessively. I kept a log that grew to 8 pages of daily readings at 16 sample points across the village. The east side never showed salt. The plant output never showed salt. I tested the source lake twice more through augured holes, fresh both times. The contamination was appearing between the plant and the taps, in a section of pipe that had been physically inspected and found intact, in a distribution system with no branches or valves that could account for selective contamination. People on the west side started filling jugs from the east side houses. This was practical. It was also the beginning of something I did not recognize at the time, which was the village dividing itself along a line that had not existed before. West side families came east for water, and they came with a look I had never seen in Kugnik before. Not anger, wariness. They looked at their neighbors' houses the way you look at a lifeboat from the water. The sound grew louder through April. By mid-month, everyone could hear it. People described it differently. Eileen said it sounded like something large breathing under the ground. Delia said it sounded like the ice shifting in the lagoon, except the lagoon ice was 6 miles away and the sound was directly underfoot. James O'Klesick, who is 74 and has lived in Kugnik longer than anyone, said he had heard a sound like this once before, in 1971, just before the old village on the barrier island started losing ground to erosion and the Corps of Engineers ordered the relocation. He said the old people at the time had a word for it that roughly translated to the land remembering water. He told me this standing outside the store on a Tuesday afternoon, hands in his pockets, looking south at the tundra. He said it without drama or fear. He said it the way you say something you have known for a long time and hoped you would not have to say again. The crack continued to widen and lengthen. By April 15th, I had traced it for over a quarter mile. It no longer ran in a single line. It had developed 3 lateral branches, all extending north toward the lagoon. and the overall geometry looked, from the map I was drawing on graph paper each evening, like a root system growing toward the coast. The widest point was now 5 inches. In several places I could see down into the crack far enough to confirm that the frost walls gave way, at depth, to darkness. The crack extended below the frost layer. I dropped a small rock into the widest section and did not hear it land. On April 20th, the utilidor post that had been tilting finally broke its footing and dropped. The utilidor sagged into the crack and the insulation wrap split. The temperature was -8. I had approximately 6 hours before the exposed pipe would freeze. I called every able-bodied person I could reach on the CB, and we spent the rest of the day and half the night building an emergency support from salvaged lumber, lifting the utilidor section back into alignment, and rewrapping the insulation. We saved the pipe, but the crack beneath it was now 8 inches wide, and when we set the new supports on the opposite side of the crack from the original footing, I measured the gap with a tape and felt something I had been managing to avoid feeling until that moment. The ground on the west side of the crack was lower than the ground on the east side by approximately 4 inches. The west side of the village was sinking. I called the borough that night from the plant's satellite phone because the landline was down. I told the on-call utilities supervisor everything: the salt water, the crack, the subsidence, the sound. I read him my measurement log. He listened without interrupting, which was either professional or stunned. When I finished, he asked me if I was recommending an evacuation. The question hit me like a boot to the stomach, because I had not said that word even to myself. I told him I was recommending an immediate geotechnical assessment and that the western portion of the village should be evaluated for structural risk. He said he would pass it up the chain. I asked for a timeline. He said he could not give one. Eileen was awake when I got home. The kids were asleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, and she had my graph paper map of the crack system spread out in front of her. She had added to it. While I had been at the plant, she had walked the line with a flashlight and extended my survey another 100 feet to the west, where the crack reached the edge of the gravel pad and disappeared into the tundra. She had also measured the width at her marked points, and her numbers were consistent with mine. She looked at me across the table and said, "This is going to get worse." She did not ask. She stated it. I sat down across from her. I said yes. She asked me what I thought was happening. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know, but the salt water and the cracking and the sound were not separate problems. The salt water appeared on the west side. The crack ran east-west through the west side. The sound was strongest on the west side. The subsidence was on the west side. Whatever was happening was localized, directional, and progressive, and it was centered somewhere west of the village, between us and the lagoon. Eileen said something then that I did not argue with and have not been able to get out of my mind. She said, "The land is not breaking." She said, "It is opening." She said, "The difference matters." May came, and with it the first suggestions of thaw. The sun was above the horizon for 18 hours a day by mid-month, and the temperature hovered between 0 and 15 above. The snowpack began to soften, then to sag and darken. The tundra showed its first open patches of brown vegetation and standing water. Breakup was still weeks away, but the light alone changed everything. You could see the crack clearly now. You could stand at the east edge of the village and trace it with your eyes all the way to the western margin and beyond. It looked like a scar. The subsidence on the west side had reached 14 inches by May 1st. Delia's house had developed a visible lean. The borough had not sent the geotechnical team. I called every 3 days. The answers were always procedural. The request was in process. Funding was being allocated. The assessment was prioritized but not yet scheduled. I recorded every call in my log with the date, the name of the person I spoke with, and what they said. I did this because I have lived in a village my entire life, and I know how things disappear when they are not written down. On May 8th, Two things happened that I have to describe separately because they happened simultaneously, and connecting them took me another week. The first, I was testing the morning water at the plant, and the source water, the raw water coming in from the lake through the intake line, tested salt. Conductivity at 31,000 microsiemens. The raw water had never tested salt before. The contamination had been appearing after treatment in specific taps, but the source had always been clean. Now the source was salt. I flushed the line, tested again. Salt. I flushed for 20 minutes, salt. I shut down the treatment system because I could not in good conscience chlorinate and distribute seawater and call it drinking water. The second, Eileen's cousin Marcus, who lives in Wainwright, called that morning to ask if we were all right. I asked him why he was asking. He said he had heard from a pilot who flies the mail route that Kugnik's lagoon had changed color. I asked what he meant. Marcus said the pilot told him the lagoon water between the barrier island and the village, which is normally gray-green in spring, was dark, almost black. The pilot said it looked like the water had deepened by a significant amount, which did not make sense because the lagoon is shallow, 5 to 8 feet in most places, and has been surveyed multiple times. I walked to the west edge of the village after hanging up. The lagoon was visible from there, about a mile away, across a flat expanse of melting tundra. The ice was breaking up in patches, and in the open leads I could see the water. Marcus was right. It was dark. Not the gray-green of spring melt mixing with silt. Dark like depth. Dark like the ocean shelf edge where the bottom drops away. That afternoon I shut off the distribution system entirely. I could not pump salt water to 263 people. I informed the village council, which is 4 people sitting on folding chairs in the community building, and I told them the source was contaminated, and I did not know why, and I could not fix it with the tools I had. The council president, Annie Kignack, asked me how long people could go without piped water. I said every house had stored water, some more than others. If we rationed and collected snowmelt, maybe 2 weeks before it became a health issue. She asked if there was an alternate water source. I said there was the river, 8 miles south, but the ice was not safe for snow machine travel, and we had no way to transport bulk water from that distance. Annie called the borough. She used language I have never heard her use, and she is a patient woman. The borough said they would arrange an emergency water delivery by helicopter, and they would have the geotechnical team on the next available flight. The helicopter came on May 10th with 4,000 gallons in a sling-loaded bladder that they set on the gravel pad east of the school. People lined up with jugs and coolers. The scene looked like footage from a disaster relief operation, except the disaster was invisible. The buildings were standing. The sky was clear. The temperature was a pleasant 22 degrees. But the water under the village tasted like the ocean. The ground was cracking open. The western houses were sinking, and there was a sound rising through the permafrost that no one could identify or explain. The geotechnical team arrived on May 12th. 3 people, a permafrost engineer, a hydrologist, and a technician with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They worked for 4 days. I was with them for most of it, partly because they needed a local guide, and partly because I needed to understand what was happening to the system I was responsible for. The GPR results came back first. The permafrost engineer, a woman named Dr. Shan, showed me the profiles on her laptop in the plant. I am not a geophysicist, but I have seen enough GPR images to understand the basics. The profiles showed the expected layering. Active layer on top, solid permafrost below, grading into deeper frozen sediment. Except under the western portion of the village, starting at approximately the line of the crack, the profile showed something different. At a depth of about 40 meters there was a void. Not a lens of unfrozen ground, which can occur naturally in permafrost, metallic. Not a pocket of gas, which can form from decomposing organic material. A void. a space. The GPR signal passed through 40 meters of solid frozen ground and then encountered an interface where the permafrost ended and there was open space below. The void extended to the west, toward the lagoon, and the GPR could not determine its full extent because the signal attenuated beyond their equipment's range. Dr. Shan said the void appeared to be connected to the lagoon through a channel of unfrozen material that ran approximately at the same depth, 40 meters, and trended northwest toward the coast. I asked her if the void could be natural. She said talix and subpermafrost voids occur in areas with geothermal heat sources or with significant hydrological flow. Kugnik has neither. The nearest geothermal activity is hundreds of miles away. The subpermafrost hydrology in this region is not supposed to support void formation of this scale. She said the void was not consistent with any model of permafrost behavior she was aware of. I asked her what was in the void. She said, based on the GPR signal characteristics, water, salt water. A large body of salt water sitting 40 meters below the surface, directly under the western half of the village, connected to the ocean through a channel that passed below the permafrost to the coast. The hydrologist, a quiet man named Chen, had been testing the source lake while Dr. Shan ran the GPR. His results confirmed what I already knew. The lake was contaminated, but his testing was more detailed than mine. He had profiled the lake at multiple depths through augured holes, and he found that the contamination was not uniform. The surface water was fresh. The bottom water, near the intake depth, was salt. A halocline had formed in the lake, a boundary between fresh surface water and denser salt water below. The salt water was entering the lake from below, through the lake bed, which sits on permafrost that was apparently no longer intact at that location. Dr. Shan, Chen, and I sat in the plant for a long time after they shared these findings. The technician had gone to the community building to charge her equipment. The three of us were alone with the boiler hum and the overhead lights and the numbers that did not fit. I asked them the question I'd been carrying for 2 months. What was causing this? Dr. Shan said she did not know. Chen said the subpermafrost void and the channel to the coast suggested a thermal or mechanical process that was degrading the permafrost from below, from a depth where climate warming could not explain it, because surface temperature changes take centuries to penetrate to 40 meters. He said something was warming or eroding the permafrost from underneath, and it was doing it in a way that was creating a pathway between the ocean and the subsurface, and that pathway was now reaching the village's source lake and the ground directly beneath the village. I asked if it would stop. Neither of them answered immediately. Dr. Shan said she would need to study the data further. Chen said the rate of subsidence I had documented, 14 inches in 6 weeks, was extremely high for any permafrost degradation process, and it suggested that whatever was happening was accelerating. He said if the void continued to expand and the channel continued to propagate, the integrity of the ground under the village would become increasingly compromised. I asked him what that meant in practical terms. He said it meant the buildings on the west side would continue to settle and eventually fail. It meant the water source would remain contaminated. It meant the crack would continue to widen and branch. And he said, with the careful precision of someone who does not want to be wrong, but cannot avoid what the data shows, that there was no guarantee the process would remain confined to the west side. The GPR profiles suggested the void was extending east, under the village center, at a depth of about 50 meters, deeper but present. They flew out on May 16th. Dr. Shan said she would expedite her report and recommend immediate monitoring equipment installation. Chen said he would push for an alternate water source assessment. They were professional and thorough, and clearly disturbed by what they had found. And when the twin otter lifted off and I watched it disappear south, I felt the way I felt the day my Uncle Raymond handed me the keys to the plant and said, "It is yours now." Alone with something I was not sure I understood well enough to keep running. The next 3 weeks are difficult to describe because they were not dramatic. They were the slow, grinding experience of a community adjusting to a reality that was shifting under their feet. The borough delivered helicopter water every 4 days. I maintained the delivery schedule and tested every bladder before distribution. The salt was still in the system, still coming up through the lake bed, and I kept the plant shut down. People adapted. They collected rain and snowmelt. They filled containers from the helicopter bladder. They carried water the way their grandparents had carried water before the plant existed. The village did not die, but it changed. Something about the daily routine of getting water from a rubber bladder next to the school. Something about the sound underfoot that never stopped. Something about the crack that was now visible from any point in the village. These things accumulated in people's faces and movements and conversations until Kugnik felt like a place that was holding its breath. The subsidence reached 22 inches on the west side by June 1st. 2 houses were condemned by the borough structural inspector who came in on June 3rd. Delia moved in with her niece on the east side. James O'Clesick refused to leave his house even though the floor was visibly sloped. I could not make him. Nobody could make him. He said the old village had sunk too, and they had stayed until they could not. On June 6th, Eileen and I walked to the western edge of the gravel pad in the evening light. The sun was circling the sky without setting, as it does in June on the north slope, and the light was golden and flat and fell across the tundra in a way that made every crack and ripple visible. The crack system had expanded into a network that covered almost an acre of ground. The wider sections had filled with meltwater, and the water was dark. I knelt and tested it. Salt. Conductivity over 45,000. The subpermafrost ocean was now reaching the surface through the cracks. Eileen stood beside me and looked west toward the lagoon, which was now open water, dark and still, and she said, "It is already here." She was not talking about the salt water. She was talking about the lagoon. The barrier that had been permafrost, 300 feet of frozen earth between the ocean and the village, was compromised. The channel Dr. Sean and Chen had identified was not a tunnel or a pipe. It was the ocean itself, pressing inland through the frozen ground, finding weakness, widening it, dissolving the permafrost from below and replacing it with itself. The village was not sinking into the ground. The ground was turning into ocean. I reported this to the borough. I reported it to the State Division of Homeland Security. I reported it to every agency whose phone number I could find. The responses were consistent. They were aware. They were monitoring. They were developing a response plan. Nobody said the word evacuation to me. I began to understand that nobody would, because an evacuation of a North Slope village requires a destination, and housing and infrastructure and political will and money and time, and the process that leads to those things takes years, and we did not have years. We might not have had months. On June 14th, James O'Clesick's house dropped 3 feet overnight. The pilings on the west side punched through the gravel pad and into the void below, and the house tilted like a boat listing to port. James was inside. He was not hurt. He was sitting in his tilted kitchen when I got there at 5 in the morning, drinking instant coffee from a mug he had to hold at an angle to keep it from spilling. He looked at me and said, "Now you understand?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "The land remembers water, because the land was water." He said the permafrost is not the ground. The permafrost is a lid. He said the old people knew this. He said they moved when the lid opened, and they came back when it closed. And they had been doing this for longer than anyone had records for, and each time the shape of the coast was different afterward. I asked him why he had not told me this before. He said he had been hoping he was wrong. He said the last time the lid opened was before his grandmother was born, and he was not sure if the stories were literal or metaphorical until the salt came through the tap. This is the part I keep coming back to. Not the data. Not the subsidence measurements or the conductivity readings or the GPR profiles. The part where James O'Clesick told me, in plain language, that the land beneath our village periodically becomes ocean and then freezes again, and that this process is known and old and has nothing to do with climate change or infrastructure failure or anything a borough engineer can fix. The part where a lifetime of treating water and maintaining systems and filing reports and trusting measurements met something that does not fit inside any of those containers. And I had to choose whether to believe the instruments or the old man in the tilted kitchen. I believed both. That is the problem. The instruments confirmed what James was describing. The GPR showed the void. The conductivity showed the ocean. The subsidence showed the lid opening. The data was not contradicting the story. The data was the story, told in a language I had been trained to read but not to interpret. The borough announced a temporary relocation on June 22nd. Not a permanent move. A temporary relocation to Wainwright, where housing was being arranged in the school gymnasium and in spare rooms. People would return when the situation stabilized. That is what they said. The situation would stabilize. I spent the last 2 weeks before the relocation shutting down the systems I had maintained for 9 years. I drained the treatment plant. I closed every valve in the distribution system. I disconnected the intake line. I shut off the boiler and let the building cool for the first time since I had taken it over from my uncle. The silence in the plant when the boiler stopped was not silence. It was the sound underneath, the one that had been there since March, now unmasked by the absence of machinery. Standing alone in the cold building, I could hear it clearly. It was not coming from below the floor. It was coming from everywhere, as if the ground and the walls and the air had become a single resonating body, and the sound was the frequency at which the transition between solid and liquid happens when you are listening from inside the substance that is changing state. I locked the plant door on July 3rd. The last helicopter lifted the last group of residents from the gravel strip that afternoon. Eileen and the kids had gone 2 days earlier with the school families. I was the last person in Kugnik who was not James O'Clesick, who refused to leave, and who I found that final morning sitting on the gravel outside his collapsed house, facing the lagoon, with a calm I could not access and did not fully understand. I asked him one more time to come with me. He said no. He said someone should be here when it closes again. I asked him when that would be. He said he did not know. It might be soon. It might be a long time. He said the old people did not wait for it. They went and came back. I left him there. I got on the helicopter. I watched Kugnik shrink below me, and I could see it all from the air. The cracked network dark with salt water, the tilted and collapsed structures on the west side, the gravel pad ending abruptly at the edge of the expanding dark water that was no longer distinguishable from the lagoon, and sitting in the middle of it, the water treatment plant I had locked an hour earlier, its steel walls reflecting the July sun. From 500 feet, the village looked like it was sinking into a dark mirror. We have been in Wainwright for 4 months now. Eileen and I share a room in the old teacher housing. The kids are in school. I work at the Wainwright water plant as an assistant operator, which means I do for someone else's system what I used to do for my own. The satellite imagery of Kugnik that I check every week shows the same thing, a little more each time. The western half of the gravel pad is gone. The cracked network has merged into a single dark area that's connected to the lagoon. The school building is partially submerged. The fuel tank farm is leaning. The water treatment plant is still standing, but the ground around it has subsided to the point where the building appears to sit on a peninsula. James O'Clesick is still there. We know this because he answers the satellite phone the borough left with him once a week on Thursdays. His answers are always the same. He says the sound is louder. He says the water is closer. He says he is fine. Last Thursday, he did not answer. The borough called twice, no response. They called again Friday, no response. They are planning a welfare check flight when weather allows. I check the imagery every night after Eileen and the kids are asleep. The most recent image, from 4 days ago, shows something I have not told anyone about yet. The water treatment plant is no longer on a peninsula. The ground around it has merged with the lagoon. The plant building is standing in open water. And east of the plant, on the part of the gravel pad that was still intact last week, on the part where my house stood, where I counted 192 steps every morning, there is a new structure. It is small, roughly square, and it is not a building I recognize. It was not there in last week's image. It sits on ground that was 4 days ago dry. The water level in the lagoon has not risen. The ocean has not advanced. The ground is simply no longer there, but the new structure is. And when I zoom in as far as the resolution allows, the shadow it casts is wrong for its height, as if the structure extends further down than up, as if most of it is below the surface, in the space where the permafrost used to be. I have not told Eileen. I do not know what the structure is. I do not know who built it. I check the image every night and measure its shadow with a ruler against the known scale of the satellite frame, and the shadow gets longer each time, which means the structure is either growing or sinking, and either of those is impossible, and neither of those is more impossible than salt water coming out of a tap on treated freshwater pipe. And I have learned in the last 5 months that impossible is a word for things you have not measured yet. I am going to call James on Thursday. If he does not answer, I am going to ask the borough to put me on the welfare check flight. If they refuse, I will charter one myself with the savings we have left. Eileen does not know this. She would tell me not to go. She would be right. I'm going to go anyway, because I locked that building and I need to know what opened it, and because James was right about everything else, and because somebody has to read the meter when the water comes back clean. If the water comes back clean. I still count my steps in the morning, walking to the Wainwright plant. It is 214 steps from the teacher housing to the door. I have never miscounted, but last Tuesday it was 215, and this morning it was 216. I am not walking slower. The distance is not changing. I am going to keep counting.